In 1911, the poet Edward Thomas wrote to another poet, Lascelles Abercrombie, saying he was keenly looking forward to seeing his new work called The Sale of St. Thomas, adding rather acidly, but not to its dedication, which is certainly enough to have you checking Abercrombie's largely forgotten poem to see exactly which disagreeable person had earned his dedication. The Sale of St. Thomas is a play, and at least the first act was self-published in 1911, and the dedication only appeared in that edition. You can just see on the left there, there is no dedication. The dedication in the first edition was to Arthur Ransome, my friend. I suppose you could characterize this talk as an effort to explain why Edward Thomas was so offended and why the point at issue was not as trivial as it seems. It involves going a very long way and meeting a lot of rather strange people, with the consolation that all of them knew Arthur Ransome. I'll start with Edward Thomas, now accepted as one of the major poets of the 20th century. His association with Arthur went back to 1903, when the 26-year-old was part of teenage Arthur Ransome's bohemian days in London. Neither was at all well known, or really known at all, and the two men scratched a perilous kind of living reviewing books for literary magazines, a rebellious style of life that suited them and had the advantage of setting Arthur on the road to becoming extraordinarily well read. It was not long before he could easily match words with his Oxford-educated friend, Edward Thomas, although Thomas was slow to recognise this and rather resented it. For a short period, the two men shared lodgings, and Thomas was possibly present at Arthur's very first encounter with Ivy, who unhappily became his first wife. He was present at their marriage and retained the connection with Ivy after Ransome went to Russia. It was, however, always an extremely asymmetric relationship. To put it at its simplest, Arthur was afflicted with a serious case of hero worship. The last thing a struggling poet needs, one particularly prone to depression, is a misguided, albeit enthusiastic fan. And it did not take long before the older man considered Arthur to be a nuisance, dismissing him behind his back as a lightweight literary nonentity. Some of the more waspish exchanges with the poet Gordon Bottomley about Arthur are simply cruel. If he considered him at all, it was not as his equal. Each fatally underestimated the other. Alas, great poets often turn out to be rather unpleasant people, and Edward Thomas was no exception. He was killed at Arras in 1918, at about the same time as Arthur Ransome's brother. I'll turn now to the third man in this literary triangle, the man who wrote that unfortunate dedication, Lascelles Abercrombie. He also dates his relationship with Ransome to 1903. There he is, top right. He was a member of the Georgian school of poets who lived in and around the village of Dimmock in Gloucestershire. In the early 1900s, Ransome's own misguided poetic ambitions brought him to Dimmock. He even accompanied Abercrombie on an expedition to interview Thomas Hardy, the two of them thrown out for their impertinence. Given the competition, which included, as you see, Robert Frost and Rupert Brooke and Edward Thomas himself, Ransome could never be more than a kind of earnest camp follower at Dimmock. His lifelong friendship with Abercrombie was similar to the boyhood bond he established with Robin, the youngest son of the Collingwood family. Both ended up as Oxford luminaries at a time gone now when that was a mark of extraordinary erudition. In his autobiography, Arthur Ransome claims he profited from many hours of discussion with these two men, since both of them were extraordinarily knowledgeable with regard to fairy tale. One dedication that caused no offence was that of Swallowdale to Abercrombie's daughter Elizabeth. This is the American edition. I hope I persuaded you that Arthur Ransome surrounded himself with poets, and not simply any old poet, but towering masters of the genre, because I've certainly not exhausted his personal poetic connection. Among the English, you could add Bottomley, Lawrence Binyon, who was his cousin, T.S. Eliot. And as for the French, well, we shall come to those. One of the periodicals that Ransome and Thomas wrote reviews in was called The Eyewitness. It was founded in 1911 by Cecil Chesterton, G.K.'s brother, and yet another poet, Hilaire Belloc. They were hoping to get an audience for their own brand of Christian socialism. The periodical lasted little more than a year. It did, however, publish Arthur Ransome's long review of a book by his friend and companion, Edward Thomas, a biography of the Belgian novelist, symbolist poet and playwright Maurice Maeterlinck. We are perhaps entitled to ask who was Maurice Maeterlinck to merit a biography, because it's true, he's very little known now. But that was not the case in 1911. By then, his erudition and the esoteric complexity of his symbolism had earned him Belgium's only Nobel Prize in Literature. And his play, Pelléas and Mélisande, produced by the poet Jean-Paul Faure in Paris in 1882, is considered a masterpiece of symbolist drama. It is the basis for the 1902 opera by Debussy. But there is another question we're surely entitled to ask, or I should say we are surely entitled to ask. One you're certainly asking yourself. How on earth did it come about that Arthur Ransome would be chosen, still less would choose, to review a book about a Belgian symbolist poet? The answer to this intriguing question involves exploring the 8 years during which Ransome regularly visited Paris, passing his days among yet more poets, this time of a decidedly French complexion. Hugh Brogan dismisses that period as little more than a brief intellectual flirtation, a bout of French flu, as he puts it. I suggest it was more than that, although Arthur went to great lengths to hide the fact, and we shall come to the reason for that. His links with the modernist avant-garde was profound. Did it have an effect on his fiction for children? How could it not? The passages in the autobiography dealing with Ransome's numerous visits to Paris between 1904 and 1912 were written years later, and infuriatingly they are vague, beginning with an extraordinarily insouciant comment about his very first visit. Imagine my writing a memoir. I am actually writing one right at the moment. And I happen to mention that my first trip to the Lace District was arranged by a chap called Arthur Ransome. And then I say no more about it. Ransome's account of his first visit to Paris was like that. He went with Clive Bell. Bell was a hugely influential art critic, author, and a key figure in the English literary establishment. In particular, he was a member of the coterie of artists, writers, sculptors, musicians surrounding the Wolfs. Irreligious, free-thinking, decadent to a degree, they were willing to use their privileged social status to political ends, as you see here. Clive Bell was certainly celebrated enough to be seen as quite a catch by the culture vultures of the Paris literary scene. And chief among that was Maurice Maeterlinck and his partner, Georgette Leblanc. Since she was somebody else's wife, they had left Belgium and set up home in Paris. From 1895 until the outbreak of the Great War, they established the most celebrated literary salon in Paris, devoted to symbolism as a means of expression in theatre, poetry, music and literature. Clive Bell flourished in such surroundings. We don't know, but Ransome surely tagged along. He was certainly present at another salon, the regular Sunday meeting of poets, writers, artists, musicians, held at the home of the reclusive Remy de Gourmont. No accent on the Remy, high priest of the symbolist movement. From the long, extremely adulatory essay about Remy de Gourmont in Ransome's Portraits and Speculation, it's clear that he had not only a deep understanding of the symbolist movement, but was also sympathetic to its aims. In 1912, he published an English translation of de Gourmont's A Night in the Luxembourg Gardens. He was in distinguished company at about the same time Aldous Huxley was translating The Virgin Heart. In 1930, The Natural History of Love, a comprehensive trans-species treatment of copulation, was translated by Ezra Pound. De Gourmont's work was much concerned with sex. It's no small matter to translate a text replete with sexual allusion, and Ransome's skill in this regard I find a little disconcerting. It's worth asking why he should choose to translate a book he knew had been widely condemned as, quote, indecent. I think I know the answer, but I shall have to leave the question hanging. His many visits to the Rue de Saint-Père, where de Gourmont lived, overlapped with de Gourmont's passionate infatuation with the American heiress and militant lesbian Natalie Clifford Barney. If you don't know Natalie Clifford Barney, look her up. The literary salon established by this extraordinary young woman spanned 6 decades. Initially in her country estate, and then at 20 Rue Jacob in Paris, she played hostess among many, many others. They number hundreds. Colette, Mata Hari, Auguste Rodin, Ezra Pound, Jean Cocteau, T.S. Eliot, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Nancy Cunard, Peggy Guggenheim, Isadora Duncan. Rumour has it that Marcel Proust knocked at her door, but finally funked the encounter. It had been her play, Equivoque, about the poet or poetess Sappho, that led her to abandon the countryside in 1909 when someone objected to her holding an outdoor performance, which according to one newspaper was felt to follow nature too closely. So she established here a Sapphic Académie des Femmes as a response to the all-male Académie Française. Since he was working on his ill-fated biography at that time, Ransome must have discussed Oscar Wilde with Natalie Barney, although he doesn't mention it. Natalie had actually met Wilde as a child in New York, and one of her most enduring lesbian partnerships was with Wilde's niece, Dorothy, or Dolly. The poet, Olive Custance, had been one of Natalie's lovers before she unwisely married Lord Alfred Douglas in 1902. Seriously ill and almost grotesquely disfigured, Remy de Gourmont and Natalie Barney were familiar figures in the world of the Paris Literary Salon. His name for her, Amazon, is immortalized in the book of intimate love letters penned to his beloved Amazon. These references to Amazon and to Sappho are intended to be teasing to those familiar with Ransome's novels for children, but I have a more serious intention. It is to establish what may be the rather surprising fact that Arthur Ransome was indeed extremely well qualified to review a book on symbolism. Not, of course, Arthur Ransome, the literary innocent of 1903, a kind of male ingenue, but someone altogether more formidable, extremely knowledgeable about and embedded in the feverish world of left-bank symbolist poets, a man intellectually committed to a school of literary thought which clearly took Edward Thomas by surprise. In this biography, Thomas takes issue with Maeterlinck's approach to symbolism in poetry, discussing the famous collection Serres Chaudes, hothouses. He writes, I quote, "The piece is hardly more than a catalogue of symbols that have no more literary value than words in a dictionary." Well, Arthur Ransome was having none of that. Mr. Thomas, he writes, assumes that an attitude towards life induces an attitude towards words. It does not occur to him that the contrary may be possible. Thomas either misunderstands the nature of symbolism or knew nothing about it in the first place. Well, all authors learn it's a mistake to expect your friends to write favourable reviews, but Thomas probably thought with friends like that he hardly needed enemies. Let me go back and try and unravel Ransome's pretty turn of phrase about words and the world. It does not occur to him the contrary may be possible. What does he mean? He appears to be claiming that our language determines, as distinct from simply influences, the way we see the world. This hypothesis, usually associated with the work of Benjamin Lee Whorf, continues as a hotly contested issue in contemporary psychology. I may say in contemporary journalism. Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, for example. But its literary consequences are so profound, so complex, so far-reaching, that I'm going to simplify them to a simple, single aphorism. It is not the writer who tells the story, but the reader. Ransome's review refers to his own version of this aphorism, which appeared in an essay distinguishing what he calls kinetic and potential properties of narrative. If you think the words of a text are there simply to say something, he claims, you could not be more wrong. Speech, somewhat miraculously, allows us to trade abstractions with other beings of our species. Language allows us to act as symbolizing beings. Writing isn't speech, of course, it's an invention, not a discovery. But unless we're stupid enough to allow the skill to atrophy, it permits much the same mystery. Written words act on the reader's mind, prompting association beyond the writer's control. If I may put it very crudely, I may read the author's description of a cat, but when I read it, the cat in my head is mine, not hers. Authors contribute the words, readers determine what they mean. Arthur Ransome said in that essay, a work of art is a collaboration, and the purpose of fiction is to bring about a state in which author and reader inhabit the same mental world. Now, obviously, the meaning of what was written resided at some point in the writer's head, but once out there in the world, it evokes subterranean mental processes in the reader. It's not that some texts mean more than they say. All of them do. Now, this is a pretty dramatic insight, and I believe Arthur Ransome was among the very first to spell it out, at least to an English-speaking audience, long before W.H. Auden and T.S. Eliot made much the same point. Indeed, Auden's aphorism, I quote, "To read is to translate," typically puts the point in a nutshell. Let's remind ourselves at this point that we're talking about the author of Swallows and Amazons. If he meant what he said, perhaps we should look more carefully at that slippery word, symbolism. And where better to start than with Maurice Maeterlinck's most influential work in that tradition, The Blue Bird. The story is to be found in Andrew Lang's The Green Fairy book, published in 1892. Along with the Grimm brothers, it was one of Ransome's Bibles. Maeterlinck borrowed only the title, presumably to trigger fairy tale association. His story is greatly different from the original. We follow the journey taken by a little girl called Mithil and her brother Tiltil in search of the blue bird of happiness. In classic style, we meet a good fairy, Berylune, who helps them. The children are given a magic talisman, a diamond, allowing them to travel in time, even visit the dead. A loyal dog looks after them, and there is a rather untrustworthy cat. And of course, along the way, we meet a wicked, albeit rather pretty, witch who does her best to spoil things. The play had its premiere in September 1908 at the Moscow Art Theatre, directed by Konstantin Stanislavski. The secretary to Moscow Arts Theatre at that time, Mikhail Lykodopoulos, a close friend of Arthur Ransome. He translated Ransome's book on Oscar Wilde into Russian and was the man, some of you may remember, that Ransome suggested should run that infamous post-revolutionary Petrograd news agency. Stanislavski's production took 2 whole years to stage. Its success made Maeterlinck enormously rich enough to buy a castle and an international celebrity. He was made a count. He won the Nobel Prize. The critic of the New York Times saw the London production and wrote that parents would no doubt take their children home, fearing the numerous awkward questions they would pose. There are libraries filled with the range of symbolic reference in The Blue Bird. I will spare you one in particular, written in 1989, in which I counted in the first few pages references to astrology, numerology, colour science, humoral theory, folklore, anthropology, ornithology, spiritualism, the occult, magic, esotericism. Shall I go on? We may well believe that Maeterlinck intended all these elusive references, but even if he did, it's pretty certain the children watching, the ones asking, "What did it mean, Daddy?" did not notice them. If we extend Ransome's views on the roles of the reader, to include the theatre spectator, among all the eager faces watching the show, there were surely none who knew of the occult properties of beryl or the number of months in a lunar year, which raises a very awkward question, since the audience plainly did not share the associative world of the impressively erudite Maurice Maeterlinck. What purpose did this wealth of symbolic allusion serve? I have come to the hinge of my talk. It's an important question because I'm going to claim that Ransome's novels for children draw on the same symbolic tradition. If you have never thought of Arthur Ransome as a symbolist, suspend disbelief for at least the remainder of this talk, while I try and persuade you. I owe some of what I'm going to say to a neglected tranche of 40 or so letters between Arthur Ransome and R.C. Trevelyan, written between 1932 and 1950 and held in the archives of Trinity College, Cambridge. Bob Trevelyan was a prolific author of narrative poetry, translator of classical poetry. He's very little known now, but he was very much a part of the Bloomsbury avant-garde, as much a part as Clive Bell. His Cambridge connections brought him into the ambit of exactly the same people, including, incidentally, E.M. Forster, with whom he visited India. With these modernist connections, it is interesting that his choice of correspondent is the author of Swallows and Amazons. The Trevelyan correspondence is not referenced in Brogan's biography or in Ransome's own autobiography. None of the letters appear in Signalling from Mars. This is particularly surprising because they contain a number of illuminating comments about Arthur Ransome's approach to narrative. Two letters in particular illustrate why I find this correspondence so intriguing. 1934, Ransome writes about what he calls books of my sort, saying, I quote, "They depend at least as much on their readers as on their writers." Now, isn't that a familiar thought? Second, in 1936, when he was working on Pigeon Post, he says how tired he is of being labelled for 10 to 14-year-olds, and he writes of the pleasure he takes in Trevelyan seeing, I quote, "what I am trying to do," and that he has, to some extent, succeeded. Well, if not written for those ages, then for which? And what exactly are we to make of the implication that few of his countless readers see what he's trying to do? For an answer to these questions, go back to Maurice Maeterlinck. The Bluebird involves the retelling of a fairy tale, recast so that roots are barely visible. On the surface, an archaic, almost pantomime structure, a brother and sister, aged about 9 or 10, set off like Hansel and Gretel, or indeed like Dick and Dorothea or Roger and Titty in one of their excursions. In time-honoured style, they meet and overcome obstacles and eventually return to discover what they were looking for. The blue bird of happiness was already waiting for them at home. The committee which awarded Maeterlinck the Nobel Prize describes the story as appealing to the reader's own feelings. So far, so good. And stimulating their imagination in a mysterious way. Well, mysterious is a cop-out. By inviting the observer to come to terms with universal riddles, the meaning of death and the purpose of life. They could well have added, they perhaps should have added, because this was the work of a man whose personal life was plagued with depression and anxiety and overshadowed by just such preoccupations. 4 years after the publication of The Blue Bird, another author finished another story, The Blue Treacle. It too was the retelling of an old fairy tale, although the original is barely visible and the author went to pains to hide it. It also has an almost pantomime structure. The heroine, this time a little girl, sets off on what we're invited to see as a symbolic journey. After many adventure, brings her home where she started, safe and sound. In the introduction to The Blue Treacle, Ransome calls it a prose allegory of mental processes meant to be enjoyed by children who should not notice that it was an allegory at all, the treacle being the general stream of unrealized experience, which is the greater part of our life. This is now speculation. I believe this is my own speculation, but I believe it is plausible. Parallels between various versions of the Grimm brothers' tale, The Goose Girl, and The Blue Treacle are too many, too explicitly contrived to be coincidental. I haven't time here to go into detail, but both deal with an abandoned girl. Both deal with her physical, emotional, and sexual development. In both, the heroine's restoration to an abandoning parent forms the denouement. Significant points of detail are echoed in the two stories. Impersonation. In The Goose Girl, a haughty maid, you can see her here, impersonates the princess, even marrying her intended husband to become a false bride. The Blue Treacle is exactly the same Oedipal theme. Tabitha, the heroine's philosophical quest, frustrated by someone called the bald-headed one, who succeeds in impersonating her. Second, hair. You may dimly remember The Goose Girl, how naughty little Conrad keeps unplaiting the Goose Girl's hair. In The Blue Treacle, the false Tabitha, who happens to be bald, explains how its hair had been cut off. Third, blood. The Goose Girl at the Well is sometimes published with the title 3 Drops of Blood, because the Queen bestows a blood-stained handkerchief on the Goose Girl daughter. In The Blue Treacle, Tabitha uses her handkerchief to dab blood away from the noses of the woolly beasts that accompany her. I hope I've said enough to demonstrate that the man who wished to translate A Night in the Luxembourg Gardens was certainly well enough informed to be aware of the underlying psychosexual charge in The Goose Girl. You hardly need a psychologist to interpret the tale as dealing with, or dare I say, symbolizing the attainment of personal and sexual autonomy. And if you have serious doubts about the sexual connotations of cutting, releasing and tying up hair, Dr. Sigmund Freud, writing in 1900, had no such doubts. Ransome's daughter, his real daughter, was very young when he wrote The Blue Treacle. Why on earth bequeath her a story filled with allusion to sexuality? And what have false brides to do with a 3-year-old? They are reasonable questions, but they are answered in Swallows and Amazons, a book written almost 20 years later, a book which opens with a benign reenactment of his own furtive departure all those years earlier. As the children set sail for their magical island, one of them, Titi, appears to articulate its author's wish, suggesting they sing something from Spanish Ladies, incidentally a favourite of Edward Thomas. We hope that we, one day, may see you again. Did Ransome have Maeterlinck in mind, as well as the Grimms, when he wrote The Blue Treacle? The title suggests he did, as does the fact that it is a narrative which uses fairy tale. And he knew the story well. More pertinently, he ensured that birds played a central symbolic role in both stories, and plainly he intended this. In The Blue Treacle, it is birds that pull Tabitha out of her state of unconscious inertia to confront the reality of the world, and a giant bird that takes her to safety in the denouement. For the author, Ransome, birds symbolize freedom, escape, and he was inviting the reader to make the same association by establishing an empathy with birds as an ineluctable part of the character of his 9-year-old fantasy daughter, Titi Walker. In our first extended encounter with Titi in Swallows and Amazon, she is, privately, being a cormorant. Later, 2 whole pages are devoted to her conversation with a polite dipper. Abandoned on her island home, she thinks of jays, parrots, cormorants and owls. She's surely unique in likening the changing sound of a kettle to the cuckoo, but we accept the bizarre claim, this being Titi, the strange child possessed of her own pet parrot. Owls feature one way or another in all the Lake novels, but particularly in Pigeon Post, again associated with Titi, as she sets off fearfully into the dark woods to douse on her own, when she considers the sound of the owl as an omen. And it is, of course, a bird that brings about the denouement in Pigeon Post, the artfully named Sappho, saving the day. Titi is a bird when we first meet her and have very last encounter with her. Indeed, Ransome's final fictional words have her protecting the nesting geese in Great Northern. You can see what he's doing here without engaging far-fetched psychoanalytic speculation. It simply becomes impossible to think of this character without thinking of birds. To think of symbolism is simply to ask what the reader makes of the writer's intention. And this, to borrow the words of the Nobel Committee, is to induce a sense of mystery in the reader, by force of repetition if nothing else, to believe that something other, something lies beneath the text. I will give you just one more example. Ransome entitled Chapter 3 of Pigeon Post, Consulting Slater Bob, surrounding the event with the trappings of a religious rite. The narrative is full of ceremonial words and deeds. The children process in single file. Each bears a candle. Before entering the cave, they remove their shoes. Nancy doesn't actually say, "Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standeth is holy ground," but the allusion is there. In a novel concerned with the discovery of gold, we surely meant to see this expedition as an encounter with an oracle. Little wonder that the children, after consulting Slater Bob, emerge to rescue their shoes in the sunshine, looking at each other, I quote, as if they were seeing each other for the first time. It's a phrase Ransome used again and to miraculous effect in Missy Lee, right after the descent of the gorge. I quote, "The rising sun split the horizon like an explosion. A path of fire ran from it towards them over the sea. Sunlit lit all faces. The crew of the shining moon looked at each other as if meeting for the first time." Perhaps we begin to see now what Ransome meant by what he was trying to do in the letter to Bob Trevelyan. His nuanced use of symbols enabled him to say something that he could not say directly, confronting the reader with his own preoccupation. Whether we choose to acknowledge them is up to us, but they remain as a source of mystery. It's often claimed, it's been claimed to me, that there is something paradoxical about Ransome's devotion to Rémy de Gourmont, the high priest of symbolist aesthetics. This might explain Hugh Brogan's French flu jibe. De Gourmont, after all, was the ruthless opponent of naturalism, as epitomized by the work of realists like Émile Zola. And what is Swallows and Amazons, some claim, if not the high watermark of naturalism in children's writing? Well, you will have gathered by now that I think this is the opposite of the truth. His novels owe far more to Maddox Ford and even to Virginia Woolf than they ever did to George Henty. To borrow Victor Watson's telling phrase, the swallows are magical children, and their deeds have only an appearance of realism. Get close enough and you find you've slipped with them into another world altogether, one in which elements of myth and fairy tale persistently assert themselves as proxies for the author's personal preoccupation. I will conclude by considering two of these preoccupations. Fear not, we're nearly finished. The critic Andrew McInnes refers to a sense of personal insecurity that pervades much of Ransome's fiction. It's absent in his non-fiction work. He rests the claim on an analysis of the quotation from a sonnet by Keats about Cortes that opens Swallows and Amazon. There are over 40 references throughout that book to the place Titi christens, the peak in Darien. The point is, of course, that Cortes did not in fact discover the Pacific. Vasco de Balboa got there first. Keats probably knew this at the time. He certainly knew it by the time he revised the poem, but he let the error stand. Now, this is hardly the place to debate a theory that Keats saw himself as a man doomed to come second. I think it's true. But the question is whether similar feelings of literary inferiority motivated Ransome's choice of the epigraph. More to the point, whether they invaded the creation of his fiction. And I think the answer is yes. Allusions to coming second or coming too late are so pervasive in Swallows and Amazons, it's impossible to think them coincidental. From the moment they set foot on the island, we're repeatedly reminded that someone had beaten them to it, to the point where the observation becomes almost tiresome. Not simply the discovery of the secret harbour, the painted tree stump, but the catalogue of smaller incidents, the ancient fireplace, the pile of logs, the dropped clasp knife, all confirm that, like Cortes, they were not the first. Let me run quickly through the other lake novels. Peter Duck's Cave, well, it was Ben Gunn's long before Titty made it hers, and Roger's Golden Cave had already been excavated by others. The discovery of the buried coin in the cairn is very touching, but it only confirms a nostalgic sense that these children are reliving someone else's past. They are children fated to repeat rituals not wholly their own. Too late, wails Titty right at the end of Swallowdale, as unwelcome smoke rises from their own fireplace. Someone's got it after all. The theme of coming second or arriving too late could be said to define Winter Holiday. From the outset, Dick and Dorothy are cast as outsiders, too late to the game. It's the swallows who possess the lake. The best they can do is negotiate entry into the charmed circle. And while Dick claims they reach the pole first, Ransome ensures we know pretty well that someone had evidently beaten them to it. Fears that the prospectors will be beaten to the gold by their hated rival drives the narratives of Pigeon Post. The Picts and the Martyrs finds Ransome shamelessly looting swallows for signs of belatedness, the lost knife, the hidden frying pan, and there's no doubt at all that the dog's home belonged to somebody else long before Dick and Dorothea called it home. Jackie tells them so. As to the why of all this, well, Ransome tells us he came to regret the fact he'd abandoned a university career for life as a literary free spirit. Although phenomenally well-informed, easily outstripping those of his contemporaries who counted themselves university men, he felt he had underestimated the intellectual context provided by collegiate university life. In particular, he never experienced the rough and tumble of debate. He never learned how to shake off hard knocks. The result was the paradox that is Arthur Ransome. As we've seen, he rubbed shoulders with major literary and intellectual figures of his age: Edward Thomas, Robin Collingwood, Ford Madox Ford, Hugh Walpole, Joan Negushi, Remy de Gaumont. Yet he remained an outsider. Not a hanger-on, at best simply hanging on. There is no table celebrating Ransome in the Closerie de Lilas. Yet he was certainly there. His name does not feature in any of the lists of literary celebrities that decorated Paris Salon Life, Maeterlinck, Clifford Barney, Remy de Gaumont, Martha Bibesco. Yet he must surely have been there. We know he met the symbolist poet Jean-Paul IV, but only because he told us. Jean-Paul himself doesn't mention it. Hugh Walpole claimed that it was the Wilde trial that affected Ransome more than anyone realised, but it was Walpole himself who humiliated Ransome in the Petrograd news agency, literally ordering him out of the room for his impertinence. For Walpole, his years in Petrograd produced 2 novels. The most Ransome dared was The Elixir of Life, that very few have read, and a timid translation of Libidesky's The Week, I hazard read by no one at all. His Russian experiences created someone prone to buckle at the hint of critical censure, touchy, overly quick to take offence, above all unwilling to acknowledge his mastery of a genre that he had invented. By his own account, fears of literary failure literally haunted him. By the time he began Swallows and Amazons, the stress of intellectual insecurity, all too evident in the autobiography, came close to killing him. You need only turn to Missy Lee to see those fears and insecurities vividly symbolized in the character of Captain Flint, surely Ransome's alter ego, defined by Miss Lee as less than a university man. He spends his time humiliated, infantilized, a caged figure of fun for little boys to mock. It takes all the author can do to keep the reader from losing faith in Captain Flint. But of all these captains, it's only Flint who knows where they are, and it's his rescue of the symbolic sexton, his only positive act in the whole novel, that redeems him. One other preoccupation, the final one, the night sea journey. The night sea journey, as you know, is a mythological motive with an extremely long history, longer than writing. Written accounts of journeyed into the dark, with or without the possibility of return, go back as far as writing itself. Homer, who appears on page 1 of Swallows and Amazons, provides one such account, as well as providing the name for another of those pigeons. Hemingway's biblical title is also a knowing nod in the direction of countless stories of the fate of the sun, swallowed up by its daily descent into the sea, symbolically acted out as visits to the darkness of hell, descensus ad inferos. Tales in which heroes are swallowed up by whales, dragons, monsters, and the like. Fairy tale quests for buried treasure or the search for pearls beyond price reflect hopes of return. Indeed, in some versions of the story, the regurgitated soul is plucked from the monster's mouth by a rescuing bird, albeit not invariably a blue bird. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung noted that the night sea journey was a commonplace of his own dreams and fantasies and those of his patients. Quite late in his life, long after Ransome had written most of his story, Jung claimed this kind of archaic imagery to be a universal property of the human mind, to be a genetic endowment. It's far too late in this talk to consider that, but it's not hard to believe that ubiquitous counts of a journey into the night reflect a primordial desire in all of us to escape from a thoughtless, almost neurotic mode of existence and find some authentic way of living. And that's an idea we've already met. Swallows and Amazons has allusions to Homer. It also has characters searching for buried treasure. It has characters diving for pearls, and they do it again in Swallowdale. Am I overinterpreting? After all, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but the evidence suggests not. Ransome put this perilous journey into the night at the heart of almost all his novels, and we do not need to turn to Carl Jung to determine what he had in mind. He was perfectly explicit about his intent, using terms in the Blue Treacle that Jung himself could well have written. The existential problem dominating his life, the quest for an authentic mode of existence. I quote, an escape from unconscious living, a realization of a moment of experience, such a realization as we all continually perform. From Swallows and Amazons to Missy Lee, the motif of the night sea journey haunts his work, stamped with his own particular authorial trademark, a repertoire of negative psychological properties. Consider the very first voyage of the Swallow into the night with its crew of 3. Although disguised in the narrative, it is a journey involving seriously broken promises and almost reckless error. It is also a journey from which there could well have been no return. The crew of the Swallow, in this case pretty obviously duffers, leave Titty, a 9-year-old girl abandoned on an island, alone in the dark and in real danger. Yes, she emerges heroically, but no thanks to them. Winter Holiday brings us aboard an ice yacht, sailing blithely into the night. Dick and Dorothy are hopelessly lost in an impenetrable blizzard, surrounded by wreckage which puts an end to hope of going back. Here too the voyage rests on a catalogue of misunderstanding and error, beginning with the misread signal. Yes, they find the North Pole, but as with Titty's capture of Amazon's boat, it's little more than a happy accident. You may think the fact that the remaining late novels, Swallowdale, Pigeon Post, Picts and Marchers, are set on land is impossibly challenging for my hypothesis, but not so. Titty and Roger, blundering through thickening fog in Swallowdale, have all the familiar hallmarks. Equally perilous, it rests on their near-fatal belief that the compass is faulty. Ends with Roger abandoned, injured, fearful, alone. Not much hope of a return either. Only the prospect of the woodcutter's hut where, I quote, "It would be only too easy to begin thinking of the old charcoal burner as a sort of ogre who might take a fancy for eating ship's boys." And Pigeon Post, the journey into the unknown dark of the shattered mind, genuinely perilous, leaves us, the reader, with the odd conviction we've somehow been left behind. As for the fate of these children, whose mistakes left them entombed with a candle, only a candle, to light their way, all we know for certain is there was no going back. I quote, "John came out of the tunnel. He had the cut end of a string in his hand and was coiling it up. His face had gone quite white." The Picts and the Martyrs, the last of the late novel, also the most resolutely, quote, realistic. But even here Ransome calls on the night sea journey, albeit as a kind of joke. Two children hurrying through the dark, authors of their comically bungled burglary. Nevertheless, it ends with Dick, abandoned and alone, with no way out. This perilous sea journey into the night finds its most obvious and most literal expression in We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea, often considered Ransome's masterpiece. It's a novel in which he makes aspects of his motivation explicit. The arrival of Goblin in Holland follows, as ever, the same catalogue: error, accident, fault, abandonment, loss, even betrayal, if Jim Brading's behaviour can stretch that far. But in the description of the storm, we discover something of crucial symbolic significance. It's in the exchange between John and Susan as they scream at each other against the fury of the wind. It's a passage that has been much analysed. Victor Watson, for example, detects a strong authorial need to deal with whatever Susan represents, adding somewhat wistfully, what she represented in Ransome's life can only be guessed at. But there is no need to guess. The debate between these two is obviously about turning back. Ransome's intentions are clear. Susan's demand, "Let's turn back now," is not wholly unreasonable. We're left in no doubt that of the two it is John who will prevail, and prevail he does, even at the risk of his life, and by extension that of the crew. We must surely conclude that whatever the journey into the night symbolised more generally for Ransome, the notion of no return was not some incidental. It lay at its heart. With that in mind, we can better understand Dick and Dorothea blundering through their own personal blizzard. Dorothea screaming, "Let's stop, now, at once," and recall Dick's reply, which touches something deeper than we realise. We can't go back. We can't help coming somewhere if we go on. I hope I've convinced you that Arthur Ransome deployed the symbolism of the night sea journey with extraordinary skill to say something about his own personal odyssey. If you doubt me, turn again to Missy Lee, not a favourite of Ransome's younger readers. It's a novel in which the night sea journey is not some accident of nature, but quite simply its own whole raison d'etre. Missy Lee's father, long dead, reaches out from beyond the grave to woo back his daughter through an appeal to the path of duty, and father and daughter are reconciled. It is surely no accident that Missy Lee set her pupils to reading the Aeneid, with Virgil's account of the descent into darkness. Equally no accident she sends them out, hidden inside a dragon. It's only when faced with a cataclysmic descent of the gorge that the blinded Captain Flint finally comes to terms with his dependence, calling out of the dark, "Sorry, Susan, I was wrong. Thought there'd be more light than this."